Robert Tigner is the Rosengarten Professor of Modern and Contemporary History Emeritus. He joined Princeton's History Department in 1960 after earning his PhD at Yale. He has been closely involved in the History Department's efforts to expand its teaching and research efforts beyond Europe and North America. In fact, he introduced the first departmental courses in African and world history. His publications include Modernization and British Colonial Rule in Egypt, The Colonial Transformation of Kenya, Capitalism and Nationalism at the End of Empire, State and Business in Decolonizing Egypt, Nigeria, and Kenya, and a wonderful textbook, Worlds Together, Worlds Apart, which I read when I audited a course taught by Professors Tigner and Prakash. Tonight, he's going to give us an overview of the colonial era in Africa. Please welcome Professor Tigner.
Thank you very much for coming. The early views of African history mainly focused on the colonial period. Many scholars thought that the history of Africa was primarily the history of European colonization in Africa. The famous British historian, the Regius Professor of Modern History at Oxford University, Hugh Trevor Roper, who was a contrarian of considerable distinction. And he was not happy when African history began to appear on the scene in university curriculums. He wrote a little lecture which he gave at the University of California at Los Angeles, which was at the time, this was in the early 1960s, a significant center of African studies and African historical studies, in which he said he was not interested in the picturesque gyrations of primitive peoples in distant corners of the globe. There can be no history without progress, and the history of Africa did not start until the Africans came into contact with Europe and Europeans. So I don't need to add anything to that. I had a little note here that said, what a blasphemous view of Europe and Africa. You just came from a lecture on the Atlantic slave trade. And of course, that really is the beginning of Euro-African relations, at least below the Sahara. And it's not a happy episode in the history of Africa. There are various ways to look at the colonial period, and over 40-some years of teaching, I've tried them all. You can look at Africa by region. And I brought the map, which is up there for everybody to see. And so you have North Africa, which is not the area that most people are interested in when they talk about African history. You have West Africa, you have East Africa, you have Central Africa, and you have Southern Africa. And they each have different conditions, problems, variations. Or you could go by European interests in Africa in the colonial period. And so you have mining economies, mainly in the southern part of Africa. You have cash cropping economies, especially in West Africa, but also in East Africa, in which cocoa and tea and coffee and other products were being grown, in many cases for the first time, and mainly exported to Europe and to North America. You could go by European agents of colonialism. There were colonial officials who were mainly concerned that their colonies didn't cost the home exchequer any considerable amount of money, and who were also deeply concerned that there was political tranquility. Nothing was more embarrassing to colonial officials than for Africans to rise up in rebellion. Or you could emphasize the merchant classes, who were interested, naturally enough, in making profits out of Africa, and who invested in those parts of Africa which they thought would be profitable to them. Or you could spend some time on the missionaries, who were, in some respects, the most forceful agents of social change, whereas the colonial officials were hesitant ever to involve themselves in the family lives of Africans. The missionaries often thought that this was the most important arena in which to involve themselves. Polygamy had to go. Female circumcision had to go. You may well agree with the missionaries in this respect. And the colonial officials down deep, I think, agreed with the missionaries, but were extremely fearful that missionary involvement in the inner activities of African families and African social lives would lead to rebellions. And in fact, that often happened. Or you could emphasize settlers, the Europeans who went to Africa and settled in various parts of Africa, especially, of course, in southern Africa, especially South Africa, the Rhodesias, and particularly in Algeria and some others in Kenya. And what they sought for themselves, but for themselves, not for the Africans, was to recreate an idealized vision of European society. For many of them, the idealized vision of European society was a world that was not yet industrialized, not heavily urbanized, in which they could be planter aristocrats. But I do want to emphasize that they wanted these things exclusively for themselves. And so virtually everywhere in these settler economies and societies, the kind of system of apartheid, this separate development of races, was emphasized. It only became formalized as a formal system of official government policy in South Africa in the elections of 1948. But everywhere you see the Europeans living separately from the Africans, sending their children to separate schools, enjoying parliamentary privileges for themselves, but not for the African populations. Oh, those are all good ways of looking at Africa, are they not? But that's not what we're going to do today. I intend, however, to look at Africa by periods. 4 of them, in fact, seem to me to be important and to highlight the Euro-African experience under European colonial rule. First came partition and conquest. Most of these periods last 15 to 20 years. Partition and conquest, let's say roughly 1882 to 1900. About a 20-year period of time for the Europeans to gobble up all this territory in Africa, apportion it among themselves, and then to establish some semblance of administration on the ground. That is followed, uncharitably, in my language, by the era of pillage and plunder, 1900 to 1914. And I will soon reveal to you why I call it pillage and plunder. That then was followed by the classical colonial era. I leave out the world wars, 1920 to 1940. This is the period that most of us have some knowledge of. The British practiced indirect rule. The French got excited about their civilizing mission. The Belgians thought that they were good paternalistic colonizers, and so on and so forth. And then finally, all too abruptly, way before the Europeans thought that this was going to happen, we enter the era of decolonization. Over in 15 years for the most part, with some exceptions, 1945 to 1960. The great colonial administrators of the 1920s, or before the 1920s, would have turned over in their graves had they known that Africans would become independent by 1960. They expected the colonial period to last for a very long period of time. After all, the British had ruled India for a couple centuries. The Africans, and I'm now, mind you, I'm using the terminology of the Europeans, the Africans were far more primitive than the Indians, and so their preparation, their tutelage under colonial authority would be certainly several hundred years, maybe more. Okay, let's go to this first period of partition and conquest. As I said before, 1882 to 1900. There's an irony here in this story. The continent closest of all to Europe is Africa. And yet, for the most part, Africa remained completely politically independent from European authority right up until the very end of the 19th century. Before 1882, here's where the Europeans were, formally speaking. The French had taken over Algeria, and there was already a settler colony there. The Algerian Dey had made a grievous error when he slapped the French ambassador across the face when they were having a discussion. It was not appealing to the Algerian Dey. And the French responded by sending troops. Nobody could insult the French in that fashion. And so this was in 1830. French already had not a colony, as I think many of you know, but an overseas département, an overseas province of France. The French were along the coast of Senegal. The British had a freed African slaves colony in Sierra Leone. They were along the coast in what is today Ghana, the Gold Coast, along the coast in Nigeria at Lagos. The Portuguese, because of long-standing interest in this part of the world, were along the coast in Angola and Mozambique. These were important slave trading areas for the Portuguese. The British were in two crown colonies in South Africa. The Boers had trekked into the interior and had two independent states in the interior of what later on became the Republic, the Union of South Africa. That was it. That was it in 1882. The Europeans are along the coast. And you can ask the question, well, this seems very strange. The Europeans are in occupation of India. They have all kinds of interests in China. The Dutch have colonial authority in Indonesia. What is it with the Europeans in Africa? And I say there are several reasons. The first is that Africa had the reputation, a deserved reputation, as the white man's graveyard. George Padmore, Pan-Africanist, West Indian Pan-Africanist, who spent the last years of his life in Ghana celebrating Ghanaian independence, told Kwame Nkrumah that the first statue that got erected in Ghana should not be to Nkrumah, it should be to the Anopheles mosquito, because it brought malaria and kept the European settlers out. But there was also a third reason, and there's probably others as well, and that is the Africans proved themselves to be quite good at keeping the Europeans at bay. Africans kept the Europeans along the coast. That is until 1882. I guess I could use a colloquialism. Then all hell broke loose. And within 15 years, really within a decade and a half, with some exceptions, I'm not going to get into the details, not enough time for that. With some exceptions, the whole of the African continent was partitioned among a certain number of European powers. I can't remember now how many. I think it's 7, but let's not get caught up in these numbers. All divided up. 2 exceptions. Liberia, because the Americans had an interest in Liberia. They were the suzerains over Liberia. and therefore Liberia was spared. And Ethiopia, we will get back to Ethiopia in a little bit to understand how and why Africans could repel the Europeans. So everything seemed to come to a head, and I even gave you a single year in 1882. Lord Salisbury was the British Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary for the Conservative, the Tory party through much of this period. And he's a good guide for us. He's a very articulate and literate gentleman, as were many of the British statesmen at the time. He made this statement in 1884 when he came back to office, when the Tories won the election. He said, "When I left office in 1880, and nobody said a word about Africa. When I returned in 1884, Africa was on everyone's lips." What had happened? Why this extraordinary interest and rapid partition of a huge continent? Mind you, the size of the African continent is quite extraordinary. Let's take territorially the largest country in Africa, Sudan. Sudan is as large as the whole of the eastern half of the United States to the Mississippi River. This does not, in other words, this does not give you a proper perspective on Sudan. It's an enormous country. King Leopold took over what is incorrectly, the only thing in this map that seems to me to be incorrect is labeled Zaire. It's Congo today. He took it over as his own personal possession. It came under the, formally, later on, under the administration of the Belgians. He took it over. It was nearly 80 times the size of Belgium. So these are big territories, massive amounts of territory and large numbers of people. And so the question arises, why? Why in 1882? Why all of a sudden do the Europeans take this interest? And naturally you would think people are greedy, people do things for economic reasons, but when you look at the African continent at this time, there were only a couple places that you could say were really financially attractive or compelling. South Africa had diamonds, not yet gold, but it had wealth. It had a substantial European population. Egypt owed to Europeans, if you can believe this, 100 million British pounds in the 1880s. That was a lot of money in those days. It's nothing now, considering the stimulus packages, but this was 10 times, more than 10 times, the size of the Egyptian annual budget, their revenue. And that was a country that was really in deep debt. And there was some trade in West Africa, but the rest of the continent was pretty much unknown. And so, but not completely unknown, because the African continent had attracted all of these European explorers and travelers, some of whose names are surely familiar to you. David Livingstone had written lots about Africa. Burton, this renegade figure of British society, was the absolute opposite of Livingstone. Whereas Livingstone thought all of the women in British society were beautiful and elegant and sophisticated, Burton thought that they were uptight, uninteresting, nowhere near as exciting as the women in the rest of the world. But they were both fascinated by Africa, and they wrote about it in great depth. Bart, Speck, and then, of course, Stanley, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. The British orphan who went to the United States made a reputation for himself as a journalist. And they gave this view of the African continent as being a place of undescribable riches, so that the Europeans got caught up in the enthusiasm for occupying territory there. Also, it turns out that colonial conquest was good politics, very good politics, especially for the conservative parties who were trying to stay in power during an era in which democratic reform was taking place. In British society, universal manhood suffrage was coming about. And the conservatives, like Salisbury and others, were concerned about staying in power. Whoa, what about using colonial successes to keep themselves in power? So there was that advantage. Third, there was a completely altered balance of power in Europe by the 1870s. Germany was newly unified, and the Germans were beating their chests, sure that they were going to become a supreme power, many of them convinced that a supreme power had to have colonies, like the British. They all wanted to find their British India, maybe perhaps in Africa. And Italy was a newly unified country, also eager to join the powerful countries of Europe. And you might say, in some respects, Africa was the last place, well, maybe North America, maybe the United States, the last place where an enterprising, ambitious individual could really make his mark. And some of these individuals were extremely influential, even in extremely bizarre fashions. The founder of the German colonial experience in Africa was a gentleman by the name of Karl Peters. Now, Karl Peters is really an oddball. He believed that everything that was a multiple of 3, divisible by 3, was going to be a good moment for him. So he decided that he would enter Africa, East Africa, in 1881, divisible by 3. And he went around East Africa, getting the various chiefs in what is now Tanzania to sign treaties, turning over their authority to the German government. This in spite of the fact that Bismarck, the chancellor of the German state, had said Germany was a satiated country, not interested in acquiring colonies. They were expensive, they were bothersome. Who needed them? In 1884, divisible by 3, he came to the coast with a whole truckload of these treaties that were signed, by which time Bismarck had changed his mind, and he accepted these arrangements for what became called German East Africa. So there's one strange guy who's out there sort of on his own, kind of founding an empire. Another strange guy will be well known to you, Cecil Rhodes. Went off because of health problems to South Africa, got inspired by the colonial enterprise, thought the British were the top of the heap. In his opinion, God had selected the British as the best governors of the world and the best policemen of the world. He used to sit in his office in Cape Town. He had a globe right in front of him on his desk, and he would always spin it so that Africa came toward him, and he would rub his hand against the globe, against the African continent on the globe, and say, all red, that is my dream. You do understand that red was the color of the British Empire. Of course, he had this Cape to Cairo ambition, and one of his subordinates, way ahead of his time, he was in the space age, not quite so spacey as maybe some of the others, but he was part of the space age, and he claimed that he would soon be pegging out claims for Britain on the planet Jupiter. Finally, as, as Rhodes began to anticipate his death, he was not well. He sought immortality. He had already helped the British acquire the Union of South Africa. The two Boer republics were brought into the British Empire. Northern and Southern Rhodesia and Nyasaland. And so once again, he made a statement to one of his friends as he knew his last years were approaching. They can't change the name of a country, can they? You probably know. They did change the name of the country so that Southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, Northern Rhodesia, Zambia. So we have this extraordinary conjunction of factors taking place in the 1880s and leading to the partition of the African continent. But that's an easy word to say, the partition of the African continent. But what does it mean? I mean, this is a huge continent. Well, the Europeans, first of all, in spite of the fact that they had made a pledge to one another that partition that could only occur and the colonial territory could only be established if the Europeans had authority on the ground. But that promise, that principle was violated right at the beginning. Because what the Europeans basically did in the 1880s is they divided up the continent in the chanceries of the European states. The statesmen sat down in Paris, in London, in Brussels, in Berlin, and drew the lines by which the African continent was to be divided up, apportioned out to the European powers. That's the main reason I brought the map along, so that you could see what the map actually looks like and what the boundaries of Africa look like. A lot of straight lines, right? Tremendous number of straight lines, you know, straight lines. There's some wiggles over here. How come these wiggles? Well, very, very simple reason. First, there was a straight line right down here in Nigeria between the British in Nigeria and the French in what is now Benin, was called Dahomey at the time. But they were aware that this might be awkward for African populations, so they created these boundary rectification commissions and sent them into the area so that they could make sure that at least some towns and villages were not divided right down the center. And that's why we have the squiggles here, there, and everywhere. But it wasn't a good job. Not at all. And it left Africa with a terrible heritage. Salisbury, again, is a very, very good authority on this. He wrote later on, after all of this partitioning had taken place, after he was out of office, he said, we sat down in the chanceries of the European states, and we divided up and we apportioned out to ourselves the lakes, the rivers, and the mountains of Africa, with only one slight hindrance, that we never really knew where the rivers, the mountains, and the lakes were. What they did, the one thing that they did know from all of those travelers and explorers was rivers and river basins. Totally fascinated by rivers and river basins. You know, they were trying to find the source of the Nile, the source of the Congo River, the source of the Niger River. And so if you look at the map again, roughly speaking, Sudan constitutes the river basin of the Nile. Congo, Zaire, constitutes the river basin of the Congo River. But what they didn't know, they hadn't a clue about African ethnicity, about African tribes, about African communities that were accustomed to living together. And the results over the long run were horrendous. Take Nigeria. Southwestern Nigeria is mainly occupied, mainly inhabited by the Yoruba-speaking peoples. You want me to write that on the board? Yorubas. I hope you know that. Y-O-R-U-B-A. Alas, here in eastern part of Benin, there are other Yorubas. Even worse, down here where Kinshasa is now, was the center of a great Bakongo empire in the pre-colonial period. When the partition was over, some of the Bakongo lived here in French Congo, some lived in the Belgian Congo, and some lived in Angola. And their dreams of somehow reinventing themselves, refurbishing their great empire, were dashed by these arrangements. Now you might say, if you're smart, as you all are, well, why didn't the Africans do something about this at the time of independence? Well, think about it. Because actually, these are the boundaries that the Europeans established. The only area that I am aware of that broke away and established itself as an independent entity was the area of Eritrea. Now, there have been civil wars, southern Sudan, eastern Nigeria, various other places. But think about the problems of trying to rearrange boundaries 50, 60 years later. I'll give you an instance just to clarify why this is such a huge problem. Let's say, as was the case, the Yorubas in southwest Nigeria thought, well, we really ought to change the boundary with Benin and incorporate all these Yoruba-speaking peoples into the Nigerian Federation. Not a bad idea. Not acceptable to the Igbos living in eastern Nigeria. Not acceptable to the House of Fulani living in northern Nigeria. They would become minority populations where they had been more powerful. And so this whole business of recalculating the boundaries was never really effectively put into operation. Well, it's one thing to divide it up in Europe. It's another thing to bring about real authority in Africa. The occupation, the conquest of Africa was swift and brutal. It was done very, very rapidly, so that pretty much by 1900, the conquest was over. And the Europeans won, generally overwhelmingly. One critic of the British imperial mentality suggested that he had a much better way for bringing Africa under European colonial rule. He said every officer should be given 2 medals before he went to Africa. And one would be taken away from him for every battle that he fought. So he was maybe fight in one battle and still have 1 medal left. But of course, the rewards were just the opposite. Fight in battles, get rewards, rise up in the social scale, and many of the great conquerors and administrators of Africa rose up into the social scale of their society. For example, Evelyn Baring. He was the British Consul General of Egypt for 25 years. He became Lord Cromer. Frederick Lugard was the conqueror of northern Nigeria. He became Lord Lugard. Herbert Kitchener was the conqueror of Sudan. And it wasn't, it was the Egyptian army that did it. But Kitchener was in charge of the Egyptian army. He became Lord Kitchener. And we could go on and on and on. And these were, I don't want to be too cynical, these were little wars that were very successful for the Europeans. One-sided victories, substantial loss of life for the Africans. Few Europeans lost their lives. an exception. Ethiopia. What in the world? How can we explain Ethiopia? 1895, an Ethiopian army defeated an Italian army of 25,000 men, took many of the Italians prisoners, killed many of the Italians. What was going on in Ethiopia? A number of things. Number one, the terrain of Ethiopia was extremely difficult. Way up there, hills and mountains. Very poor maps were available to the Italian forces. And when they engaged with Ethiopians at the Battle of Adwa, many of their regiments had lost their way. They'd gone off in the wrong direction because of their poor maps. But also, the Ethiopians had something working on their behalf. They were a Christian state with a Christian emperor. And therefore, the Europeans were willing to engage with them politically, diplomatically, commercially, supplying the Ethiopians with up-to-date military equipment. This was not made available anywhere else on the African continent. And also, the Ethiopians had a sense of national identity, as reflected in their king, Menelik, who was able to inspire his followers to resist the Europeans. And so that exception, he was able actually to put 100,000 men in the battlefield. No other African state could even get close to that. Even the North African states, even Egypt could not put 100,000 soldiers into the battlefield. So that was the exception that more or less proved the rule, that if Africans were going to be able to deal with Europeans, they would have to organize larger, more unified societies, and not the small-scale units that they possessed before the beginning of the colonial era. Okay, that takes us through. No, it doesn't exactly. The Europeans exulted in their new expansive empires. The Germans boasted of their counterpart, the British India, if you can believe it, in Middle Africa, in German Southwest Africa. It's a little bit of an exaggeration. German East Africa. They say, well, look, we got these two colonies on both sides of the continent. It's a very large landmass. Might become equivalent to British India. The French were excited. You know how the French are. They believe in precision and geographical unity and mathematical formulas. And so they said, look what we have here. We have this parallelogram in West Africa. Just what we need. And they also boasted of the fact that they had the largest amount of territory in all of Africa. To which Lord Salisbury, our old friend, made the following reply when he was being criticized in the Parliament for allowing the French to get so much land at the expense of the British. Yes, gentlemen, he said, that is true. But if you look at the map, you will see that much of the French territory is what agriculturalists call very light soil. Do you understand what this man, who is much given to understatement, was referring to? The Sahara Desert. This was light soil. The British proclaimed to all and sundry that their empire was so large that the sun never set on it. One African critic retorted that he knew perfectly well why the sun did not set on the British Empire, because God did not trust the British after dark. Still, the whole of the British Empire was a stirring sight to behold. At its high point in 1919, after the First World War, it encompassed all of the religions and major ethnic groups of the world. The Viceroy of India, who ruled over 200, 300, 400 million people, 3/4 of the population of the British Empire, was the highest paid public servant in British society. He made more money than the Prime Minister. He got £25,000 per year as his salary. All right, you think it's all, this is not very much money, but in those days it was a tremendous amount of money. And of course, the British celebrated their empire in song and literature. Rudyard Kipling was the poet laureate. He was a Nobel Prize winner, but he was the poet laureate of the British Empire. He wrote The White Man's Burden. Take up the white man's burden. It was a poem that was sent to Teddy Roosevelt in order to convince Teddy Roosevelt to take on the task of civilizing the Filipinos. Teddy Roosevelt thought it was good sentiment, but rather poor poetry. And there was a musician laureate of the British Empire, Edward Elgar. Now, I happened to be coming home this evening. I had WWFM on, and they were showing or parading some of the last night of the Pops, last night of the prom series in Britain. And of course, they had Elgar's Pomp and Circumstance, which you've all heard. I actually sometimes play it, but there's not enough time to play it here. But really, it was written at the turn of the century. It's very martial, very imperialist, land of hope and glory. God made thee mighty, make thee mightier yet. It really was a paean to expansionism and to imperial conquest. Okay, finally, we're done with that, and I'm going to be very quick with the rest. Era of pillage and plunder. It's very exciting to go through the colonial period. Everybody was keen about the conquests, written up in the newspapers. But when it's over, you've got this very difficult and very unrewarding task of trying to govern these people. And so the authorities at home said, let's leave it to the man on the spot. And the man on the spot decided that he would take those resources of Africa that were most immediately available. They were wild rubber and ivory. And so Africa had a new group of hunters and gatherers, Europeans, who just stripped the continent of all of its easily obtainable resources. And they did this for 15 or so years until those resources ran out. And until the African populations, because they had run out, began to rise up in rebellion. And there were rebellions all over colonial Africa. The most striking and shattering were rebellions in German East and German Southwest Africa. There was a revolt in German East Africa called the Maji Maji Rebellion, in which the rebels thought that if they were anointed by these prophetic figures, the German bullets would turn into water. Maji is the Swahili word for water. It didn't work, and the rebellion was put down with great loss of life. And then there was a rebellion in German Southwest Africa, horrendous rebellion of the Herero people, pastoral people who lived in the northern part of what is the northeastern part of what is present-day Namibia. And they got in the way of the Germans all the time. They just were not willing to do what the Germans really wanted them to do. And so a governor by the name of Goering, is that name familiar to any of you? Who was the father, the general, who headed up the Nazi Air Force during World War II. And the chief military commander, General von Trotha, proclaimed what they called, in absolute language, an extermination policy. They drove the Herero population into the Kalahari Desert. And the population was reduced over a 2-3 year period of time from 85,000 to 15,000. The era of pillage and plunder, the new hunters and gatherers, could only last so long. The wild rubber was gone. The populations were in rebellion. After World War I, we get the classical colonial period, in which the Europeans enunciated their philosophies of colonial rule. And I think they're familiar to you. The French said that they were engaged in a civilizing mission in Africa. The British said that they were engaged in a dual mandate. They would benefit, but so would the Africans. The Belgians said that they would practice a form of paternalistic colonialism. The Portuguese said that they were the only non-racialist group among the Europeans, and that they would form some sort of close bond with the African populations. But there was one thing that was at the heart of these new colonial philosophies, that the primary resource of Africa was not gold or the diamonds of Southern Africa, not the cocoa, not the coffee of West Africa, not the tea and the sisal, the pyrethrum of East Africa. It was the African as a laborer. And therefore, you had to be concerned about the health and at least the rudimentary education of Africans. But mind you, this so-called classical colonial period only lasts about 20 years. And it's in the middle of it, the Great Depression occurs. Now we move to the period after World War II, the era of decolonization, which was a total surprise to all of the Europeans. They thought they were going to be there forever. In fact, they were there for 50 or 60 years. What happened after World War II that changed everything is the complete change in the balance of international power. The British and the French were exhausted by the war. The Germans, of course, were out of Africa. The Russians and the Americans were the superpowers, neither of which had any opposition to the political independence of African states. But the political independence that came about was as careless, abrupt, unthought out as the partition. It was quick, it was hasty, it was unsuccessful. Because African states, one after another, went from the complete authoritarianism and autocracy of the colonial period, in which all power resided in a district officer, a governor, a military commander. It went from that arrangement to, can I say it, an excess of democracy. All of a sudden, overnight, universal suffrage was permitted in all of these African states. And can you imagine what it's like for populations who have never participated in elections before to have this opportunity of engaging in elections? And can you imagine what it's like for the politicians to appeal to a not very well-educated electorate? And what happened was that the politicians made all kinds of reckless promises. Free education for everybody at every level. No more unemployment. Health care for everybody. Electricity. Potable water. And so on and so forth. Even though they knew that it was going to be impossible. What I like to call an apocalyptical view of independence appeared. In other words, when independence came, everything would be transformed. The world would be changed inalterably, all for the benefit of the Africans. Not surprisingly, it didn't work out that way. And when independence came, and these charismatic and messianic politicians who were being praised by their electorates and their followers as latter-day prophets, millennial figures, were not able to deliver on their promises. Out they went. Coup d'etats, tribal antagonisms, and corruption and failed states. So I see that my time is up, and I want to finish with just a few words. You may feel that this is too negative a view of the colonial era. I gave a talk to the French American Club in New York City 10 or so years ago. I talked about the French Empire in Africa. And I said there were some good things and some bad things. And when I was finished, I gave the French a grade, C+. Straight away, somebody in the audience raised his hand and said, "Professor, can we renegotiate that grade?" Certainly, there were many good things. The infrastructure, the new ports, the big cities, the schools, the growth of populations, the better health care systems. These were important ingredients. And Africa's present discontents, which you'll be learning more about in the future, cannot be laid entirely at the feet of the Europeans. But in fact, the colonial period was a very short one. Europeans had no idea it would be this short. They didn't have any sense of urgency about their activities in Africa. In some ways, the colonial period was a brief interlude of 50 or 60 years. But as I've tried to show today, it had very powerful and, in some respects, devastating consequences. Thank you. I think we're supposed to take some questions now. Okay.
One of the outgrowths of this, what you're talking about, some of these problems is Zimbabwe. Here you've got a leader that was one of the ones that brought Zimbabwe into its independence and so on, and is not giving up power. You've got the opposition. How do you think that eventually is going to play out?
The question is, what's in the future for Zimbabwe? Man, that is Africa's most extreme basket case. And I don't know how it's going to work out. I mean, the Africans obviously have got to do something about Zimbabwe, but nobody seems willing to step forward and do anything. I mean, some of the problems in Zimbabwe stem from the colonial period, and the failure of Zimbabwe, Southern Rhodesia, to have an appropriate land redistribution scheme, the way Kenya did at the time of independence. And, you know, the help, I think, has to come from the Southern African states, with maybe some intervention by the Europeans and the Americans. I mean, South Africa has got to be deeply distressed with what's going on in Zimbabwe. Large number of Zimbabweans have fled into South Africa and created a great many problems there for the South African government, which is does not have an easy set of conditions to deal with. But at the moment, it seems as if Mugabe has his supporters in the military and in the high ranks of the bureaucracy, and it doesn't seem likely that there's going to be any kind of internal ousting of him. Yes, sir.
Today, are there British, French, German, British, I said that, Italian remnants, cultural remnants, still existent in Africa that make certain states different from other states?
Certainly. I think the question was, are there continuing influences of the British the French, Portuguese, Italians, not the Belgians, not so much the Germans. They were just, they were ousted after the First World War, and their colonies were taken over by the British, the French, and the Belgians. Well, language is one of the most obvious of the differences that exist. I mean, mainly, the former French colonies are Francophone speaking, although, there's a move in some of these regions toward English, and that does not set well with the French. And the French, continue to have a very important cultural influence in the African continent. I always thought that Angola and Mozambique at the time of independence should have made a decision to change their language from Portuguese to English. Now, there were not very many Portuguese speakers in those two countries. The Portuguese had done a very poor job in educating the local population. But of course, it was the elites who were in charge of things. And they spoke Portuguese, and so they kept Portuguese. Yeah, I think that even in cultural ways, when you read novels written by French-speaking Africans, they really reflect French culture. And when you read the novels written by English-speaking Africans, they tend to, be part of the English-speaking world. I mean, these are two separate cultural worlds that the intellectuals still identify a lot with. Yes?
Do you think that the problematic situation of Africa now is the result of the colonies?
I would not want to say that entirely. I tried at the very end, but I'm not talking about the last, 50 years. So the Africans have had their so-called independence for 50 years. And they have not, in a lot of respects, done a very good job. They didn't have the kind of foundations to build on that, let's say, the Indians of the Indian subcontinent had. I had to truncate the lecture at the very end, but I could have said something about the Belgian Congo. And I will, since you've given me the opportunity. The Belgians thought that they were immune from nationalist discontent. And they thought they had practiced a really superb form of paternalism. And they had a much more substantial, larger bureaucracy, many more Belgians in the Congo than there were Britons in Nigeria, for example, or Kenya. And so they thought, well, I mean, independence is coming to the rest of Africa, but we will avoid it. Then there was one scholar in the 1950s who said, well, we ought to think about independence. I suggest that Congo is going to get its independence in 1990. Well, all of a sudden there were political parties in the Congo, and the Belgians said, well, we'll bring all these guys to Brussels, and we know they won't be able to cooperate, and so, we can continue to rule over the country. Well, they were united on one thing. You guys got to go. Still, the Belgians thought, what can these Congolese do? There were only 14 Congolese who had a university education in 1960. There were no Congolese who were above the rank of sergeant major in the army, in the force publique. There were hardly any Congolese in the upper ranks of the Congo bureaucracy. All these positions were held by Belgians. And in fact, the commander of the force publique called together his subordinates. They were all Belgians, sitting in a room, I suppose, about this side, and he wrote on the blackboard, before independence, equals after independence. Congolese can't rule themselves. They've got to turn to us. Well, you have to have done a better job in the colonial period if you want that situation to exist. And within the first year, the prime minister got rid of the president, who got rid of the prime minister. The army mutinied. Everybody was advanced one rank in the military. So this was the first army in history that I know of that had no privates, for a while at least. The most important, the richest province, Katanga, seceded. The United Nations had to intervene. There was great loss of life, considerable chaos. The way was prepared for Mobutu, who then came in and established a kind of ironclad dictatorship for 3 decades. So, Europeans messed it up. They thought they had a couple hundred years, and they had no sense of urgency. The time was clicking for them. But that doesn't mean that we're going to let the Africans off the hook, because a lot of these African leaders did not do what was right by their populations. Yes?
What do you think Africa would be like today if the Europeans had never colonized?
Well, that really is an impossibility, because the Europeans, at the end of the 19th century, Europeans were going to be masters of the world. They saw themselves as a superior civilization, and everything would give way to Europe and European thought and arrangements. If they had decided Africa's out of bounds, or there had been a kind of an agreement among all the European powers, you say, okay, we'll leave the African continent alone. Of course, the Africans would have come into contact with Europeans. They already had. And actually, now that I think about this question, which is always asked to me, and to which I always give a very bad answer, there were some really positive developments that were underway in the 19th century. And Africans were creating their own Christian churches. And Islam was making its own way. And African merchants were, having a great deal of success establishing and running business enterprises. But really, the world would not have allowed this to happen. Indians were going to come into Africa. They were going to get involved in the African economy. European businessmen, are they going to say, oh, government has said, out of bounds, we won't touch the gold, forget the diamonds? It just is a non-starter.
You mentioned before, and I think that's the core of the African problem nowadays, that all those lines that we see there are political lines, without taking into consideration the ethnical composition of the country. So therefore, the period of independence, let's call it, from colonialism for Africa, has been transformed in a constant fight for power, for possession of land, possession of resources, and the constant coming up of new dictators, which last for some time and then they're kicked out and some other dictator comes up, like we have Mugabe now, we had the others before. So until Africa cannot develop a little sense of education, political education, it's going to be very difficult for them to survive. They're going to keep killing each other on the basis of ethnic divisions. Tutsi and Hutu and Yorubas, and like you mentioned, many others. The only apparently successful, fairly successful country so far politically seems to be South Africa.
So far.
So far.
No, I'm not going to argue with you about that. I think that was one of the points of the lecture. I will just say one thing. I don't want to get too awfully pessimistic. But if you think about the post-colonial history of the Latin American states, there are many, many similarities. And they went through a very long period of time when these same problems that you have been describing were occurring. In other words, there wasn't all that much affection for identity with the state of Mexico or with Argentina or with Chile or what have you. But you have to hope over a period of time, with some education, with some greater experience. Maybe you have to hope with economic progress, perhaps taking place. There's not much of it now. That these countries were not ready for independence in 1960. They didn't want the Europeans anymore, and with good reason. But they were not really able to govern themselves. And so now they're going through a terrible period of transition, which one might hope they'll come out. I mean, there are some hopeful examples. Ghana, they had a high degree of education before independence. They went through all the things that you're describing. Dictators overthrown by coup d'etats, military regimes. But now they've settled back into a reasonable democracy. It's not a country that has tremendous economic resources, but they're using their resources pretty wisely. Same could be said about Senegal. I mean, these are two really small countries. And when you think about Nigeria, I mean, you have to be depressed. I mean, what were the British thinking about when they put, this huge country together? They were really only thinking about balancing the budget. They took southern Nigeria, which was pretty economically prosperous, and they then conquered northern Nigeria, and they scratched their heads and they said, it would be a good idea if we put these two big and very diverse territories together. I mean, the south was predominantly Christian with some Muslims. The north was predominantly Muslim. Why would you put them together? You would put them together because the south could pay for the administration in the north. And then you got the problems that we see occurring today. Everybody out of time? No? Go ahead.
The Europeans had never shown up. What do you think the situation would be now?
We just had that question. We just had that question, and I give a bad answer to it every time.
Oh, that was the one question I didn't hear.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't repeat the question. I forgot to repeat the questions.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Is it known whether there was as much strife between various ethnic groups in Africa prior to colonization as after?
There certainly was strife. There certainly was warfare. And the Europeans made a big claim for the fact that they imposed the Pax Britannica, the French peace, whatever, the German peace over the area. And to some extent, I think that is true. It was a temporary arrangement. Meantime, but these were small-scale conflicts. People, the Yorubas were not Yorubas before the 20th century. They became Yorubas under European influence. And then as they gained a sense of Yoruba identity, we are Yorubas, we're not just people from Ibadan or Lagos or Abeokuta, and they would struggle with each other. These are all Yoruba-speaking communities. They got the sense of their Yoruba identity, and they said, wow, we're not like the Igbos. They're in the eastern part of Nigeria, and we're certainly not like the Hausas and Fulanis. And so, the scale now of violence becomes much greater. Hutu and Tutsi. Think of that. I mean, think of what was going on there. I mean, it's mind-boggling that so many people could have been killed in such a short period of time. And there was nothing like that in the pre-colonial period. I mean, they didn't have instruments for killing that were substantially different from those that had existed in the 19th century. I mean, this was a primitive form of killing. This was not the gas chamber style that the Nazis perfected. Let me see. Yes. One more. Last one.
The Cape of Cairo project, did that ever got started, or was it just a plan?
It was just a plan. I think, though, I mean, it was more than just a plan. The British made a concerted effort to get all the territory that would enable some British entrepreneur to build a railroad all the way from the Cape to Cairo. It's a huge distance. Huge, huge, huge. I mean, these guys were out of their minds when they came to. They just loved railroads. And they thought railroads were the end-all and the be-all of economic development. And they built many railroads that were worthwhile. And they also built a number of them that were absolutely no good at all. Now, the French thought they had taken over what Salisbury called very light soil. And so they thought they would build a railroad that would go like this, all the way up here to, it was going to go across the Sahara Desert. And, you know, it was really never going to pay for itself. And they built a lot of that. But, I mean, really, to think about the Cape to Cairo Railroad in the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, that's a pretty grandiose project. Okay, thank you.